Okay, let's look at how this workflow works in totality here. The idea of taking high poly details and baking them onto the low poly mesh. So in Blender here, I have a low poly mesh. This is example low. I just wanted to use a simple shape here to demonstrate this workflow. And it's low poly, all quads, fairly simple. And most importantly, it has UVs. It's UV unwrapped. And so the UVs are good. We just have the bottom and the top. There's just the one seam going around the side. That's pretty much what we would want for a shape like this. It's important to note that the low poly mesh needs to have UVs. The high poly mesh does not. Okay, so low poly mesh needs to have UVs, and it needs to have good UVs. So hence the modeling matters, which makes the UV process much easier. So low poly with UVs. And then if we were to look over here, I'll turn this off and look at this one. And so here is here. There we go. Let's get it with a different. There we go. Like ZBrush. So here, this is a high poly version of what I had. And then I just sculpted a bunch of tiny details on it. Notice that the silhouette is not changed massively. I didn't like add an arm or a horn or something to this. That would need to be represented in the low poly mesh. This is all surface level detail and not that much disruption of the silhouette. And if we look over here, very, very dense. Remember, you can always turn on stats, which is here, statistics. This is probably a good idea to have this on now so that you can sort of get a feel for how many vertices and edges and faces can your computer handle. Because during the sculpting process, your hardware, the graphics card is going to be the primary limiting factor here. And as we know now, having as much detail as possible, as having it be as dense of a remesh as possible makes all of the sculpting fidelity much, much cleaner. The tools work better. I think it just reacts more intuitively, but there'll definitely be a point at which things start to slow down, and that will totally be a function of your hardware. And having an idea where that is and how close you are to that would be, it's a good intuition to develop. Okay, so I have these two. Now exporting these. Let's see here. This Blender add-on, I'm going to have everybody add from now on. I'll link to it. So this is not on the add-ons or the, it's not in preferences. So you have to go to here, come over to here, and download the zip. And that's how you would download any add-on that's a GitHub repository. So almost every other add-on that you wouldn't get from either the Blender store or from the add-ons menu would be on GitHub. And so you could come over here and download the zip file, and then you just simply drag the zip file into here to install the add-on. That's already done. And so in object mode, you get this launch tab, and now we get this super easy export option, which is really great. I'm going to leave it set to Unity because we're just exporting the FBX, because we're going to be going over to Substance Painter, which everyone here has some experience with. And we need to have, what do we want to send to Substance Painter? We want to be sending the low poly. And then also we need to export the high poly, but that doesn't get opened up in Substance Painter. You'll see in a second. Over here, remember, this is the one, the low poly needs to have good UVs. High poly does not, right? Think about it. Unwrapping some sort of super dense mesh like this is crazy. You would not want to do that ever. Okay, so I exported both of those, and if we look inside a folder, I exported them to somewhere here, right? And so low and high, and then I'll run this from the beginning. So I'll close that off, discard that. Okay, let's open up Substance Painter, and we'll import the high poly, low poly mesh. So close this, go to File, New, select, and again, low, and open. And make sure that auto unwrap is not on because you just took the time to unwrap it. And there you go. And great. Now we are going to use the bake mesh maps process, as many of you have done before, which develops the data about all of the surface of the object and figures out the ambient occlusion and the curvature, and then stores all of that data in the mesh maps. But the new wrinkle here is that we're going to use the high poly during the baking process. So we come over to texture sets and get down to our bake button and bake interface. There we go. And so most of the time you would hit bake and it would run all of this. Now we are going to tell it, when you're going to bake the maps, don't use this mesh, use this one. And you can't drag it into here. You need to press this button and then select high and put it in there. There we go. Okay, great. Now you'll see something like this as an example. Red. Let's see if this is kind of out of there. I'm going to bake once so we can see how this doesn't work as is. And you'll see it go through its process there. And you may be looking like there's some holes, depending on how much of a difference there is between the high poly and the low poly mesh profile. And then if you come back to the painting, you can see kind of what happened. This is still the low poly. You can confirm that by coming over here and clicking on the polygon fill, and you can see the mesh of the object. And you can see kind of what happened. It tried to put a lot of the detail from the sculpt into, essentially in this case, most of it's going to get baked into the normal map. There, which you can see. And it did that successfully some places, but notably not others, where there were these large indents and also where there was some large extrusions. And so those were not covered. How can we address this? Let's come back to the bake interface, and we just tell it to, we need to sort of expand the area that is going to look around the surface in order to get all of that properly represented. So come back to here, and the frontal distance is how far we're extending out. And if we dial this up just past the point where the red goes away, that will make sure that all of that is included in the bake. And then the other way, if we dial this up, it should cover the other side. For some reason, this doesn't give you as clear of a visual there, but for this particular example, I put it about there. And now if I run the bake again, we should see just here, like as it flashes by very quickly, far fewer holes in what's being calculated there. And if we come back to this and look at it, beautiful. Okay. And so if we come back to here in our material, we can see exactly what has happened here. We've got all of that detail from the high poly mesh recorded now in the normal map. Some of it Yeah, most of it's going to go into the normal map. The purpose of doing this is so that now, in the game or in the final render, you would be able to have this much, much, much faster low poly mesh as the thing that's in the game or in the animation. And all of the detail would be happening on this. So you would not need to have that 2 million vertex mesh in the animation or in the game or anything like that. And since this was using the mesh maps already, all of the smart materials in Substance Painter will automatically work with this. So for instance, the one, let's use the metal one, where you can clearly see what's happening, right? So it has metal edge wear here. If I drag this over, you can see it figured out where the edges are on the normal map detail. And if I come in here and look at the there we go, mask builder and level, you can see I can dial this in and out, and it's taking into account the high poly shape, which has been baked into the normal maps. That's how it's accessing it now, which is part of why this is so fast, right? It doesn't need to be looking at that several million poly model. It's just reading that data out of the normal map. All right, and so let's finish the workflow, because we're going to paint the entire chess set in Substance Painter. But how do things get back, right? It's great that we were able to bake the detail, but how does this matter? How do I get it back to Blender? And so, like I said, it's in the textures, and so it'd be in the export, right? All of the mesh map data, the mesh maps aren't themselves exported, but rather the way that they affect the texturing that we're doing in Substance Painter, that is what gets exported. And if we come over here to export textures, make a folder, new folder, this is export example Substance Painter, and put them in there. We'll make sure that we select the Blender template, and that should be fine for now. And we'll say export. If we come back to Blender over here, turn off the high poly, back to the low poly. How do I get this detail on there? We need to make a material. So if we make a new material here, let's go over to this view. And you want to make sure you have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled. That one, I believe, is in the preferences. Add-ons, Node Wrangler. Okay. And then add on the low poly, right? We're essentially done with the high poly. You should save it for the sake of, going back and making changes later. But we want this to be the thing that goes in the game, that we use in the animation, so on and so forth. This was just the means to create really, really, really fine detail that then we can turn into some sort of performant mesh that can be actually used at scale, whereas this one was so dense the computer's sort of barely handling it. So over here, let's do that. Let's the shortcut here to load the textures is select the shader. You have to select the shader, and then Control-Shift-T opens up a menu where you select the textures that you want to bring in. So coming back to here, 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 and I'm going to shift click all of them and say import, and look at that. Node Wrangler automatically brings in all the textures, hooks them up where they should go, and addresses how the color space should be analyzed. And so here we have our low poly mesh. Here, I can do it this way. If I come over to this view and also tell it to show the I guess it's just in this view. Turn on the faces at some point. Oh, geometry. Yeah, right there. So you can see that this is what we've been aiming at. We've got very performant, very animatable, low poly mesh, responds easily to this kind of animation, but has all of the detail from the high poly mesh baked into it. And so this is what we're doing with the knight. The bishop, essentially the retopology was because the bishop shape needed retopology in order to properly represent it. We weren't doing the sculpt step where we take a whole bunch of detail and bake it down. For this piece, we did. Okay, so that's the whole workflow there. Let's see how that applies to the knight.